So motif, originally, you can think a synonym would be theme, although it's a little bit different. As I understand, the English word started to be used, especially in music in the 1800s, Wagner and that kind of thing. And we're all used to that if we listen to a symphony or listen to a piece of classical music or not, even folk or popular music. We get residuals coming up. The similar theme comes back and is revisited, sometimes changed a little bit, which is interesting. And then it began to be carried over into literature and into biblical literature. I think it was first used with Ruth, the book of Ruth, but then it gained ground. I drew a lot from an Israeli scholar named Shemarahu Talmon, Talmon, and he was an immigrant from Germany, somewhat recently died. A major Israeli Hebrew Bible scholar. But he was very interested in motifs and how they played out, wrote a famous article on the desert motif or wilderness motif that I refer to a lot here. And he makes the point that Israeli literature, Hebrew Bible, they don't think or they don't express themselves often in abstractions like some of our Western literature does. What I mean by that is there's really very little philosophical prose, discursive prose. Maybe Kohelet, that is Ecclesiastes, would be the only thing that approximates that. So how did they get at abstract ideas? Well, often by motifs and by repetition and narrative, and then that drives the mind to think about some kind of an abstraction like wilderness. Mm-hmm. What is that in the Hebrew Bible and how does it develop and that kind of thing? And then lastly, maybe it would be helpful to the listeners to talk about what the function of a motif is. And the function of a motif is, if you will, to re-actualize not just the thinking, but the feelings that one would have when you get a later reverberation or echo of the motif. So, for example, if we start at the Song of the Sea, obviously, the Hebrews were feeling victorious and joyous as Moses' and Miriam's song reflects there in Exodus 15. But if there are allusions to that later in subsequent scripture, how is that motif used in such a way to try and capture the same feelings and emotions and thinking that that original audience may have had to some degree? Because what happens is these biblical authors pick up these themes and motifs and they use them for future encouragement of future audiences in order to help them draw courage for new challenges. You know, if God delivered us then in such a mighty way, right, how much more so will he deliver us now, you exiles, that kind of thing.
Mm. Another is allusion, and that's a huge feature right off the bat. In chapter 1, you're speaking of hermeneutical foundations, and you bring in allusions. And I believe in that previous interview, you also said you're on a project of allusion awareness. I think it's something
right,
to that
developing
effect.
Allusion competence among readers. Right.
How do they work? What are they?
Yeah, that's a great question. So usually in literary studies or how we think just about English language, if we mention an allusion, we think of a tacit reference to another work. It's a little more complicated than that. Maybe the best way to start is with an allusion that I even used last week in class. If I say, I'll not have you be jealous by my dropped handkerchief, some of you in the audience may get that right away, what I'm referring to, especially if you're up on your Shakespeare. Mm-hmm. And then, I'm alluding to Othello and his madness and envy that drove him crazy and even to murder. But if not, then I have to give you more verbal clues, as Shakespeare says, or something like that, in order to make a mental connection with what myself, the person doing the speech utterance, towards you, the addressee, are trying to grasp. So that's how allusions work. In the field, this book deals a lot with intertextuality, which is simply stated a relatively new method, even though it's been practiced in some form for years by the Greeks and even the Hebrews and rabbis. But it's where subsequent texts refer to earlier texts. So now you want to ask, well, how are they referring? Everybody in the audience, I'm sure, when they read their English Bible is familiar with direct citation, because one of the biblical authors will say, as it is written, or as Isaiah says. Even though he may be appealing to more people than Isaiah, he groups it under Isaiah.
Frustratingly to the contemporary scholars.
Yes, right. Or you could have a subtle citation where it's clearly a quote, but no introduction. So that's a second category that I think is helpful. And then when you move further on the spectrum to allusion, it becomes more subtle. Here, I tried to distinguish between echo and then the last category, or between allusion and the last category, echo or reminiscence, that allusions, it seems like the human author is often intending that later audiences pick up his allusion. So he gives enough data, a dictional link, like a word or a phrase, so the later author can pick it up and know that the original author was intending to allude. And then the last category is echo, where it's even more subtle, and maybe there's a concept overlap, maybe there's not a direct group of words, but nevertheless you read a subsequent author and you say, oh, obviously, when he talks about slave and slavery and being delivered, he's thinking in Exodus categories, even though he may not be using the same language. And so it's more subtle, and hence more effort on a Bible reader's part has to be exercised, or in the case of a scholar, to prove that it's a genuine echo.